The year was approximately 1274 BCE. Egypt stood tall, its golden age in full bloom. Under the 19th dynasty, Pharaoh Ramesses II, newly enthroned and untested in war, ruled over lands stretching from the cataracts of Nubia to the borders of Canaan. Egypt's wealth flowed from the Nile and through its vassals in the Levant, but that control was fragile. Further north, in Anatolia, a different empire had risen, one less glorified in modern memory, but no less powerful. The Hittite Empire, under the command of King Muwatalli II. Unlike the static centralism of Egypt, the Hittites managed a patchwork of client kings, city-states, and alliances stretching from the Aegean coast deep into Syria. The two powers were not just aware of each other, they were bound by rivalry. Between them lay the battleground, the city of Kadesh. Strategically located on the Orontes River, Kadesh was no simple city. It was a node of influence, a fortified checkpoint at the fork of ancient trade routes linking Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant. Whoever controlled Kadesh held the eastern Mediterranean. For Egypt, holding it meant protecting its Syrian vassals and trade interests. For the Hittites, it meant consolidating their growing influence over the region and pushing Egypt further south. Years before Ramesses, the city had changed hands in a swirl of smaller battles. Egypt had taken it under Thutmose III, but lost it again as Hittite influence expanded. By the time Ramesses sat on the throne, Kadesh was firmly in Hittite hands, and its walls were manned by loyalists of Hutti. The balance of power had shifted, and the pharaoh would not accept it. There was no formal declaration, no parchment signed, no ambassador dismissed. The collision was inevitable. Both empires saw themselves as supreme. Both had divine kings claiming descent from gods, and both were prepared to sacrifice thousands to defend their pride. Egypt had begun rebuilding its army, not just in numbers, but in structure. New divisions, improved chariot designs, and reasserted control over rebellious vassals in Canaan. Meanwhile, the Hittites had absorbed smaller kingdoms into their domain, consolidating power across Anatolia and the north. What made the coming clash unique was not just the scale, although that was significant, but the records. For the first time in known history, both sides would document the coming battle in vivid detail. Temples, tablets, inscriptions, and eventually treaties would preserve the memory. And that memory began not with diplomacy, but with momentum. Ramesses II, young, proud, and ambitious, could not tolerate a rival presence so close to Egypt's borders. Muwatalli II, experienced and calculating, saw in Ramesses an upstart eager for glory and an opportunity. As Kadesh lay under Hittite control, both empires began their preparations. To the ordinary soldier, Egyptian or Hittite, it was not about glory or maps. It was about survival. But to the kings, this was about legacy. Ramesses, barely into his reign, would march north. He would reclaim Kadesh or die trying. And Muwatalli, watching from his stronghold in Anatolia, would not give it up lightly. Neither ruler suspected they were about to shape more than a battle. They were about to shape diplomacy itself. Kadesh, a city of stone and walls, became more than geography. It became a symbol of pride, of fear, of ambition. And as spring turned to summer in 1274 BCE, two empires braced for a confrontation that would echo for millennia. The winds of Syria stirred, the horses were yoked, and the desert waited. The march began months in advance. Ramesses II, still early in his reign, summoned not only soldiers but craftsmen, scribes, and recorders. He knew the magnitude of what he intended. War was a spectacle. In Egypt, it had always been that way. Part of divine ritual, a reenactment of the god's victory over chaos. And Ramesses, self-styled as the strong bull, beloved of Maat, planned to inscribe his triumph into stone before the first arrow had flown. But beyond the theater, he mobilized a real army. 4 divisions: Ammonius, Re, Ta, and Seth. Each bore the name of a god, each with its own standard and command structure. Estimates vary, but the force may have reached 20,000 men. Infantry, archers, support crews, and the pride of Egypt's military, charioteers. Egyptian chariots were built for speed and agility. Lighter than their Hittite counterparts, they used composite bows to unleash volleys while in motion. Ramesses had invested in training and refitting these crews. Bronze was imported, horses were bred in Thebes and trained in the Delta, and armorers crafted new quivers, shields, and breastplates. Supplies were stockpiled. This was not a punitive raid. It was a campaign fully equipped for conquest. Ramesses led it personally, riding in a gilded chariot, his image cast as divine on temple walls before he even reached enemy territory. Meanwhile, the road north was treacherous. The Levant was a quilt of loyalty. Some cities pledged fealty to Egypt, others to Hutti. Many shifted allegiances depending on who was closer. Ramesses could not rely on local intelligence. His progress had to be cautious, yet firm. The four divisions moved in waves, not as a single block. Ammonius, the lead division, traveled with the pharaoh. Re followed behind, then Ta, and finally Seth in the rear. This staggered formation stretched the line of march, and Ramesses, believing Kadesh to be lightly defended, chose speed over cohesion. It was a fatal miscalculation. For north of Kadesh, beyond the Orontes, Muwatalli II was not idle. His intelligence network had tracked the Egyptian movement. His scouts, many posing as merchants or neutral observers, knew when Ramesses crossed into Amuru. He summoned his vassals, bringing together a force estimated at over 40,000, far larger than Ramesses expected. It included allies from Aleppo, Carchemish, and other Syrian kingdoms, as well as contingents of heavy chariotry, designed to smash through infantry and light cavalry. The Hittite chariot was not swift, but it was deadly. Larger and heavier than Egypt's, it carried 3 men, driver, shield-bearer, and spearman. Its impact in battle was devastating when used in mass. Muwatalli gathered over 3,000 such chariots, a number unmatched in any previous Bronze Age war. But his genius was not only in numbers. It was in deception. He planned a trap not just of steel, but of information. South of Kadesh, Egyptian scouts encountered 2 men who claimed to have fled from Hittite ranks. They reported that Muwatalli had abandoned Kadesh and retreated to Aleppo. The city, they said, lay open. Ramesses, eager to seize the moment, ordered his Ammonius division to press forward. Re, trailing behind, would catch up. Ta and Seth were days away. The distance between divisions widened. The pharaoh believed the battle would be one of conquest, not survival. The desert around Kadesh was dry, wind-blown, and open, ideal terrain for chariots. The Hittites waited behind the city, hidden in forested ridges and gullies to the north. Ramesses crossed the Orontes and made camp unopposed. He sent messengers to hasten the rear divisions. His scribes began drafting the inscriptions that would declare victory. It was then that 2 more captives were brought before him. Not volunteers this time, but men captured during patrols. Tortured or bribed, they confessed the truth. The Hittite army had not fled. It was nearby, hidden, and ready to strike. But the confession came too late. Even as Ramesses realized the deception, dust rose in the distance. The Hittite chariots thundered south, bypassing the Ammonius division and heading straight for the Re division, which had not yet crossed the Orontes. Re, stretched along the road, disorganized and unprepared, was hit with full force. Columns collapsed. Officers were cut down. Entire companies vanished in minutes. The noise of war echoed across the valley. Ramesses was isolated. Only a fraction of Ammonius was with him. Re was in ruins. Ta was still approaching. Seth, too far to intervene. Yet the pharaoh did not flee. He mounted his chariot, took command of the surviving officers, and prepared to hold the field. The Hittites, believing they had broken the enemy, swept forward, only to find Ramesses waiting. And thus the battle truly began. Not in triumph, but in chaos. Not with order, but with grit. Kadesh was no longer a city. It was a crucible, and Ramesses, far from the polished halls of Thebes, was no longer a god king. He was a commander, surrounded and outnumbered. Dust clouded the horizon. The roar of hooves and wheels became deafening. The Hittite chariots, over 2,000 of them, crashed into the exposed Re division like a storm sweeping through brittle reeds. Egyptian lines buckled almost instantly. The men of Re had not yet fully formed for battle. Many were still unpacking supplies or watering animals when the assault fell upon them. Chariots scythed through tents and ranks alike, breaking bones, splintering shields, and scattering any semblance of cohesion. Commanders were killed before orders could be given. Some soldiers fled into the surrounding scrub. Others stood and died. In minutes, what had been a marching division was a mass of corpses, broken wheels, and abandoned weapons. Word of the ambush reached the Ammonius camp in fragments. Messengers screamed of disaster, even as they arrived bleeding and breathless. Ramesses, now keenly aware that the supposed deserters had been spies, faced a shattering realization. He had been lured into a trap. His army was fractured. His rear divisions were too far to assist. His enemies knew his location and had chosen the time of engagement. All the advantages were theirs. But the pharaoh did not collapse into despair. In that moment, whatever divine titles he bore became irrelevant. He acted as a soldier, not a god. Rallying the remnants of Ammonius and any survivors from Re who had managed to escape the slaughter, he formed a defensive core around his position. These were not fresh troops. They were already worn from the march, shocked by the ambush, and uncertain of the numbers they faced. But they had their king with them, and he refused to retreat. The Hittite chariots now swarmed around the Egyptian camp, believing the victory complete. They had crushed Re, breached the perimeter, and expected Ammonius to fold just as quickly. But Ramesses had already organized a counterformation. Egyptian chariots, fewer but faster, launched from the flanks. Archers embedded within them loosed arrows in rapid volleys, targeting the drivers of the heavier Hittite vehicles. Meanwhile, infantry behind improvised barricades jabbed upward with spears as the chariots passed. The desert became a killing ground. One crucial advantage the Egyptians held was maneuverability. Their two-man chariots, one driver, one archer, could turn quickly, circle opponents, and strike from the sides. The heavier Hittite chariots were designed for brute force, not agility. In close quarters, that difference mattered. Ramesses himself is said to have charged into the melee, flanked by elite guards, striking down enemies while calling upon Ammonius with battle cries that echoed above the chaos. Whether exaggerated or not by his later inscriptions, what is clear is that his leadership prevented a complete collapse. Even so, the Egyptian situation remained desperate. The camp had been breached, large numbers of troops were dead or routed, and reinforcements were still hours away. Muwatalli, too, observing from a distance across the Orontes, had held back a substantial reserve force. He believed the Egyptian king was already broken. His mistake was in assuming that the battle was over. What followed was an endurance test. Skirmishes raged across the camp and surrounding plain as the sun reached its zenith. Ramesses personally oversaw the reorganization of his lines multiple times. Captains barked orders, soldiers regrouped into improvised ranks. The bodies of men and horses littered the field, while chariot wheels crushed bones under their relentless motion. Despite being surrounded, the Egyptians began to mount a defense that was not just reactive, it was pushing back. Then came the unexpected, a stroke of fortune that shifted the tide. The Ta division, still marching up from the south, had hastened its pace after seeing smoke and hearing the thunder of battle. Led by seasoned commanders, Ta arrived in mid-afternoon, catching the Hittite flank off guard. Though not massive in number, their arrival gave the Egyptians breathing room. The Hittite chariots, now entangled in prolonged combat and extended far from their original lines, were forced to pull back or be surrounded themselves. The fresh Egyptian troops stabilized the front. The camp was resecured. Ramesses now had control of his immediate surroundings. The Hittite first wave, overextended and suffering losses, began to falter. Yet Mu'attali still held thousands of troops in reserve across the river. Infantry, cavalry, and support units that had yet to enter the fray. He had gambled on a swift, decisive blow through the chariots alone. Now he had a decision: commit the rest and risk full engagement, or hold back and consolidate his gains. He chose caution. Perhaps he feared a second ambush. Perhaps he believed Ramesses would withdraw overnight. But in holding back, he allowed the Egyptians to regroup fully. The Seth division, long delayed, was still making its way north. Its arrival would make any further offensive more difficult. And so, as night fell over the plains of Kadesh, the clamor of battle gave way to the moans of the wounded and the low murmur of the Orontes River flowing by. There was no formal truce that night, but both armies ceased fighting. Fires flickered in both camps. Scouts monitored the river crossings. Priests performed rites for the dead. Engineers repaired broken chariots by moonlight. And both kings, in their separate tents, faced the same question: whether to attack again at dawn or withdraw and preserve what remained of their forces. Neither had won. Neither had been defeated. And the fate of Kadesh, the city both had marched to control, remained unresolved, its gates closed, its fate undecided. The battle was over, but the consequences had just begun to unravel. Morning broke over the Orontes with a reddish hue, not from the rising sun alone, but from the haze of ash, dust, and dried blood still hanging in the air. No horn sounded. No charges began. The plain that had hosted a thunderstorm of iron and hoofs just hours before was now eerily silent. The dead lay where they had fallen, some still grasping broken weapons, others contorted by final agony. Ramesses II stood in the center of his battered camp, surrounded by men who had survived an onslaught meant to destroy them. Their ranks were swollen now with the full arrival of the Ta division. And still, to the north, the vast host of Mu'attali II remained, unspent, watchful, and silent. Neither side moved. The Egyptians had withstood a tidal wave of chariots and even turned the tide, but they were exhausted. Their forward momentum had died with the sun. Supplies had run low. Food and water were running thin. Many wounded cried out for physicians that couldn't reach them. The Hittites, on the other hand, still had the numerical advantage, but they had failed to crush the Egyptians outright, despite their trap. Morale among the Hittite vassal forces, especially those who had lost commanders in the failed charge, began to waver. And Mu'attali himself, having observed the failed knockout blow, grew cautious. In the hours that followed, both armies did what ancient armies rarely had the luxury to do. They waited. Scouts were dispatched. Defensive works were raised hastily around the Egyptian camp, while Hittite engineers reinforced the river crossings and supply lines leading back into their Syrian holdings. Kadesh, the object of all this carnage, still remained in Hittite hands, though the city itself had played no direct role in the battle. Its garrison watched from the towers, seeing two titans glare at each other over the corpses of their men, both too bruised to strike again, neither willing to be the first to retreat. Diplomatic overtures may have begun even then, cautiously, indirectly, perhaps through intermediaries or local governors tied to both empires. But no truce was formalized. Each side hoped the other would blink first. And Ramesses? He did not retreat. Instead, he declared victory. The pharaoh understood the power of narrative. Though the battle had been indecisive on the ground, he knew its memory would be shaped not by swords, but by scribes. He ordered his artists and poets to begin immediately, to carve the story not as a harrowing near defeat, but as a triumph of divine will. According to Egyptian inscriptions, Ramesses had stood alone, abandoned by his officers, and defeated the Hittite host with the strength of a demigod. He claimed Ammonius himself had guided his hand, that he had slain thousands, that he had saved Egypt with his bare hands and chariot. Reality was murkier. The Egyptian army had survived, but barely. The divisions had suffered heavy casualties. Chariots had been destroyed by the hundreds, and no decisive ground had been taken. Kadesh itself remained unconquered. Yet the pharaoh's narrative reshaped the moment. In temples across Egypt, at Luxor, Karnak, Abu Simbel, Vast reliefs would soon rise, showing Ramesses driving alone into waves of enemy chariots, shooting arrows as if possessed by divine fury. His enemies fled before him in terror. His horses, named Victory in Thebes and Mud is Content, were immortalized in stone as valiant beasts that charged without fear. Back in Hittite-controlled Syria, Mu'attali faced different constraints. Hittite did not maintain the same sprawling monument-building apparatus as Egypt. Their scribes worked in clay, not stone, and their messages were recorded in cuneiform, locked away in archives, not temples. But they too would claim success. After all, they had held Kadesh. The Egyptian army had not taken it, nor had they advanced deeper into Hittite territory. From a defensive perspective, Mu'attali had protected his southern frontier. The silence between the two camps would eventually be broken, not by battle, but by withdrawal. Ramesses, unable to storm Kadesh without siege equipment or reinforcements, ordered a slow return south. The Egyptians marched back through the lands they had crossed, leaving behind a scarred field and a trail of uncertainty. The Hittites did not pursue. Mu'attali, despite his larger force, let the Egyptians go, either out of pragmatism or from the toll the first day's battle had already taken on his own men and beasts. In the years that followed, both sides would revisit the legacy of that day. Kadesh, though not conquered, had not humbled Egypt, and though the Hittites held it, they had not destroyed Egypt's army. It was a draw in blood and steel, but a draw no empire could afford to admit. The truth of the battle filtered out through merchants and diplomats. In Canaan, vassal kings wavered, uncertain who to pledge fealty to. The lines of control did not move dramatically, but the psychological war deepened. Ramesses, determined to maintain Egypt's image of dominance, ordered the Kadesh inscriptions duplicated across his kingdom. They became state propaganda, a permanent narrative of unshakable victory. They show Ramesses in heroic poses, sometimes exaggerating the enemy's numbers tenfold. And yet, even in the hyperbole, there is a kernel of reality. The pharaoh had not been broken, and that, in itself, was a kind of victory. Meanwhile, Mu'attali returned north. But all was not well in the Hittite world. He would die not long after the battle, under unclear circumstances. His death triggered internal instability and succession disputes within the Hittite court. This delayed any attempt at a renewed campaign against Egypt. The fragile balance held, not because of peace, but because both sides had been too deeply cut to strike again. So the memory of Kadesh hardened into legend. Two great powers had collided. Neither had fallen, and neither would forget. But the clash of spears and wheels was only the first act. The next chapter, played not on the battlefield, but across decades of diplomacy, would determine what peace between empires could truly mean. The years that followed the Battle of Kadesh were not years of peace, but of exhaustion. Egypt had not fallen, but it had bled. The Hittites had held Kadesh, but they had not destroyed Ramesses. What resulted was not a truce, not yet, but a pause. A tense, blood-soaked stalemate stretched thin over the borderlands of Syria and Canaan. In these lands, it was not kings, but minor lords, local governors, and city leaders who bore the brunt. They lived between two giants, forced to bend whichever way the wind blew from Memphis or Hattusa. Ramesses II returned to Egypt bearing no treasure, no captured kings, no city gates hauled south in chains. And yet, his monuments told a different story. The walls of temples declared him a conqueror, an unstoppable god of war. Inscriptions described how he had single-handedly turned the tide. But behind the stone imagery lay a political need to show strength. Egypt's borders in the Levant depended as much on perception as on soldiers. Vassals in Gaza, Megiddo, and Byblos had to believe in Egyptian invincibility or risk turning toward the Hittites. The war of image had become just as crucial as the war of arms. And so, Egypt reinforced its garrisons along the coastal roads in southern Canaan. Troop movements increased. Local leaders were bribed, flattered, or threatened into staying loyal. Egyptian officials collected tribute with increased frequency, not out of greed, but to demonstrate control. Ramesses led further campaigns, not pitched battles like Kadesh, but calculated demonstrations of strength. These were raids, subjugations of rebellious towns, and ceremonial processions meant to keep Egypt's flame burning in the north. Every scribe who followed him ensured that these were written as proof of the pharaoh's divine reach. Yet in the north, the Hittite Empire was shifting. Muwatalli II, who had commanded the vast alliance of Syrian kings, died around 1272 BCE, likely just 2 years after the battle. His death sparked uncertainty. His son, Urhi-Teshub, took the throne, but his reign was short-lived. The real power shifted to Hattusili III, Muwatalli's brother, who eventually deposed his nephew and took the crown. This internal dynastic struggle consumed the Hittite court for years. Court politics, royal marriages, religious realignments, and questions of legitimacy all tangled the empire's upper ranks. It was not outright collapse, but it was distraction. Ramesses watched closely. He used this window to reassert Egyptian dominance in southern Syria. For the next decade, Egypt waged a kind of diplomatic warfare. Embassies sent to sway cities like Ugarit and Tyre, gold offered in return for loyalty, scribes trained in the art of persuasive correspondence. The Egyptian state was unmatched in bureaucratic reach. That documented everything, and through that documentation, they imposed order. Ramesses claimed Canaan with scrolls as much as with spears. But the Hittites, for all their royal squabbles, were not idle. Hattusili III was a skilled operator, one who understood that long-term control did not come from endless war, but from secure alliances. After solidifying his rule in Anatolia, he began to extend influence back into Syria. His strength lay in diplomacy, in forging a stable ring of allied kings who saw Hutti not as a threat, but as protector against Egypt's reach. And so began a Cold War of sorts. Egyptian diplomats met Hittite envoys in the cities of Amurru and Kadesh. Gifts were exchanged, oaths were made and broken, and both sides kept detailed records. The region itself bore the scars of this silent conflict. Towns fortified their walls. Traders were taxed by 2 sets of agents, one claiming Egyptian authority, the other Hittite. Grain prices soared in the inland cities. Caravan routes were ambushed by forces not claiming any flag. Sometimes, entire villages relocated, fleeing deeper into mountain valleys to escape the pressure. Yet full war did not resume. The cost of Kadesh had been too high, and both empires had their own internal problems. Egypt faced rising tensions in Nubia, as well as concerns over temple wealth draining royal coffers. The priesthood of Ammonius, immensely powerful, had begun to act with increasing independence, a shadow government within the state. Ramesses had to balance military affairs with domestic pressures, commissioning massive temple complexes not only as propaganda, but as economic engines to keep the state running. Hattusili, meanwhile, sought to legitimize his seizure of the throne by invoking divine support and diplomatic stability. He reshaped the Hittite capital, reinforced ties with Babylon, and reasserted control over wayward Anatolian provinces. But he knew the border with Egypt remained fragile. He watched Ramesses' actions closely, calculating his own moves not in haste, but with patience. Then came the unexpected, a famine that struck both empires. Grain shortages across the eastern Mediterranean destabilized already fragile regions. Local rulers could no longer feed their people. Rebellions flared. Trade faltered. In desperation, Egypt and Hutti began to communicate more directly. Letters passed between courts. The tone began to shift. Not accusations, but inquiries. Not threats, but offers. Ramesses had ruled for nearly 2 decades by this point. He was no longer the young warrior of Kadesh. He had become a statesman. His children were grown. His monuments stretched across the Nile Valley. And Hattusili, now firmly in control of Hutti, saw the continued conflicts served neither empire. The borderlands were poor. The cities exhausted. The cost of each campaign outweighed the gains. The time had come for something the Bronze Age had never truly seen before: a formal, written peace between superpowers. But peace would not come cheaply. It required trust, shared benefit, and concessions that neither side could frame as weakness. The negotiations began in earnest, slow, deliberate, filled with ceremonial exchanges and elaborate titles. Ramesses would not deal with Hattusili as an inferior, and Hattusili would not speak to Ramesses as a god-king. They would treat each other as equals, or not at all. The letters between them survive. They are cautious, formal, and revealing. They speak of past wrongs without naming them. They offer sons to be educated in foreign courts, daughters to be married, gods to be invoked in mutual oaths. In these clay and papyrus lines, the ancient world took a step no kingdom had ever taken before. The formal codification of peace not as a temporary lull, but as a principle worth protecting. It would take years still to finalize. But the road had begun, paved not by blood this time, but by words. Kadesh had given neither empire dominance, but in its wake, it forced them to see each other not only as rivals, but as partners in survival. The correspondence between Ramesses II and Hattusili III continued for years, carried across hundreds of miles by trained envoys and royal messengers whose duties were as sacred as they were political. These were not quick exchanges. Each letter was a masterpiece of ritual language, addressing gods, kings, and dynasties, filled with symbolic phrasing and veiled intentions. Titles were carefully chosen. A misworded greeting could derail months of progress. The letters did not speak only of peace, they navigated power. Ramesses, now a seasoned ruler, signed his messages with flourishes invoking the sun god Ra and emphasizing his divine lineage. Hattusili, though more pragmatic, returned equal status, referring to Ramesses as my brother, the highest diplomatic form available, a gesture that was neither empty nor automatic. In the Bronze Age Near East, the title of brother was reserved for only the greatest monarchs, the rulers of Egypt, Hutti, Babylon, and later Assyria. It was a bond sealed not by blood, but by balance. But peace required more than words. Behind the scenes, years of tension still lingered in the Levant. Cities such as Ugarit, Kadesh, and Tyre continued their double dealings, sending tribute to both courts. Banditry along trade routes disrupted the fragile flow of tin and grain. Armies still patrolled the contested frontiers. The peace process, then, became a dance, part diplomacy, part strategy. Concessions had to be made. Hattusili, acknowledging Egypt's influence in southern Canaan, agreed not to expand further. Ramesses, in turn, recognized Kadesh and Amurru as within Hittite political orbit. The borders were not redrawn by conquest. They were defined by mutual exhaustion. What emerged from these exchanges in the 21st year of Ramesses II's reign, approximately 1258 BC, was something unprecedented in human history. The first known international peace treaty. Written in Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the day, it was etched into clay tablets in both Egyptian and Hittite versions. The language was striking not only for its terms, but for its tone. It spoke of peace and brotherhood forever. It swore that neither side would invade the other. It promised extradition of political refugees and fugitives. It even invoked the wrath of gods should either king break the oath. This treaty was not private. Both courts displayed it publicly. In Egypt, it was carved onto the walls of the Karnak and Ramesseum temples, a sacred proclamation of Egypt's honor and reason. In Hutti, clay versions were archived in the capital of Hattusa, a sign of the king's legitimacy and wisdom. Modern archaeologists have recovered copies from both sides, and the words still stand, not as faded myths, but as contractual reality. The treaty had deep implications. It stabilized the Levant for the first time in decades. Trade routes reopened. Merchants from Cyprus, Mesopotamia, and the Aegean resumed their voyages, exchanging copper, wine, horses, and textiles. Egyptian gold once again flowed north. Anatolian silver and iron traveled south. Cities rebuilt their walls, not against each other, but for pride. And young men, who for a generation had been raised for war, now served as emissaries, caravan guards, and temple apprentices. But the treaty was not merely about statecraft. It had to be sealed in a way that no one could mistake for political convenience. It required blood, not of war, but of marriage. Hattusili III proposed something revolutionary. He would send one of his royal daughters, a Hittite princess of pure blood, to become a wife of Ramesses II. This had never happened before. Egyptian pharaohs had received foreign women, yes, but they had never accepted them as equals. Egyptian kings gave no daughters to foreign thrones, and they rarely accepted foreign wives of legitimate royal lineage. Ramesses initially hesitated. Such a marriage would alter precedent. His court debated. Priests warned of divine impurity, but the benefits outweighed the customs. The marriage would transform the treaty from paper to blood, a living alliance embodied in a woman of two worlds. The ceremony took place with solemn grandeur. The Hittite princess, whose original name remains uncertain but may have been Mathor-Nefer after her Egyptian coronation, arrived with a massive entourage. Priests, handmaidens, translators, and a dowry that included textiles, horses, chariots, gold, and likely a diplomatic gift list longer than any scroll. Ramesses received her with pomp. She was adorned in Egyptian garb but honored as a royal daughter of a great king. She was not a concubine. She became queen, with her own court, staff, and influence. Her arrival marked more than a union of families. It symbolized the stabilization of an entire region. For nearly 2 decades after the Battle of Kadesh, no full-scale war erupted between Egypt and Hittite. Instead, a generation of political heirs grew up with the memory of the battle not as an open wound, but as a foundation for peace. The treaty and the royal marriage sparked further cultural exchanges. Hittite deities were introduced into Egyptian theology, not widely, but enough to reflect the diplomatic climate. Trade delegations brought Hittite cuneiform tablets to Egyptian scribes, who studied them alongside hieroglyphic records. In turn, Egyptian motifs began to appear in Levantine architecture. Shared knowledge passed between empires not through invasion, but through trust. And in the halls of Thebes and Hattusa, men and women born after Kadesh were taught not only to fight, but to speak, to write, to negotiate. Still, the peace was never complacent. It was always maintained by vigilance. Border forts were maintained. Messengers continued to travel. The gods invoked in the treaty, from the Hittite storm god Tarhuns to the Egyptian Ra and Ta, were honored yearly in ceremonies of remembrance. Odes were recited again, sometimes publicly, to remind all that the peace stood not on the shoulders of kings alone, but on the memory of what war had cost. And so, the world changed, not dramatically, but permanently. The Battle of Kadesh, a single, indecisive clash, had led to the creation of the most important political document of the Bronze Age. And from its legacy, 2 empires realized that the greatest victory was not seizing land, but securing a future that need not bleed to survive. The years following the treaty and royal marriage unfolded into what would be remembered as a golden plateau of diplomatic calm between 2 ancient empires that had once seen each other as mortal enemies. But this calm was not passive. It was maintained carefully and deliberately through constant reinforcement of protocol, ritual, and vigilance. Egypt and Hittite had not become allies in the modern sense. They remained competitors culturally, economically, and even religiously, but they were competitors who had agreed to keep their swords sheathed. Every year, scribes in Thebes and Hattusa reviewed the treaty. In Hattusa, the surviving copies were kept in palace archives written in cuneiform on clay, protected from the elements and accessed only by the king and high officials. In Egypt, temple priests read aloud the hieroglyphic versions carved in stone, ensuring that the treaty was not forgotten by the people or the gods. Festivals were often aligned around these recitations, transforming legal duty into divine ritual. It was peace by performance, upheld in part by spectacle. Mathor-Nefer, the Hittite princess turned Egyptian queen, became a figure of both diplomacy and curiosity. She brought with her not only symbols of foreign kingship, but elements of Hittite religious belief and palace culture. Though she did not displace Nefertari, Ramesses' first and most beloved queen, Matharnefer had influence. Her court introduced new languages and rituals into the Nile Valley's upper echelons. Her presence was a daily reminder of Egypt's strategic reach, not just through conquest, but through calculated kinship. Though her voice is absent from the written record, as was typical for foreign consorts, her political value was unmistakable. This alliance proved most significant in maintaining the stability of trade. With warfare halted, trade caravans once again moved safely across the Near East. From the Hittite plateau came iron tools and weapons, a rare and increasingly valuable resource. Egyptian scribes began to record mentions of black metal, the earliest known references to iron as something distinct from bronze. Although the Hittites did not yet master ironworking on a large scale, their experimentation gave them early access, and Egypt was eager to receive it. In exchange, Egypt exported not just gold and grain, but intellectual prestige. Papyrus scrolls, medical texts, and religious doctrines made their way into the hands of Hittite elites. Egyptian artisans and architects traveled with caravans, sometimes contracted to help embellish foreign temples or palaces. The symbolism of Egyptian divine kingship, the regalia, the iconography of Ma'at and Horus, began to appear in Levantine sanctuaries, not as domination, but as influence. Hutti, while holding its own gods and myths, respected Egypt's cultural gravity. Diplomatic correspondence between the two courts flourished. Surviving letters, like those found at Hattusa, show warmth, sometimes even familial banter. Ramesses and Hattusili referred to one another as brother frequently, and the letters included not only updates on political matters, but health, family news, and mutual respect. Hattusili once asked Ramesses to send Egyptian physicians to help with the health of his court, a request granted without hesitation. It was not merely a matter of state. It was a gesture of enduring goodwill. The benefits of this détente extended beyond the two powers. Smaller states, Ugarit, Carchemish, Aleppo, and others, flourished in this new atmosphere. Freed from being pawns in a larger conflict, these cities began to prosper economically. Local leaders stabilized their rule, and the cultural and commercial exchanges between regions accelerated. Hittite and Egyptian merchant guilds began establishing semi-permanent embassies in neutral ports, facilitating trade and resolving disputes without recourse to violence. But peace did not mean the absence of conflict everywhere. New threats stirred beyond the immediate reach of both empires. To the east, Assyria was beginning to rise again under new and aggressive leadership. Their ambitions were still focused on Babylon and the Zagros, but both Hutti and Egypt understood that Assyria's growing strength could one day reach into the Levant. Likewise, in the Aegean, the Mycenaean Greeks, powerful, seafaring, and increasingly involved in the politics of the Eastern Mediterranean, had begun to disrupt trade routes with piracy and sudden raids. Both Ramesses and Hattusili recognized the fragility of their moment. Their treaty was not just a peace. It was a shield against larger, unpredictable currents. Through regular exchanges, both kings emphasized the need to stand firm against external threats. Hittite records even describe proposals of mutual defense against aggression by third parties. While it is unclear how many of these plans were enacted, the intention alone signaled a new phase in Bronze Age diplomacy. Alliances based not on convenience, but on calculated mutual dependence. Ramesses himself ruled longer than any pharaoh before him, over 60 years on the throne. By the time of his later years, the peace treaty with Hutti had become not a political arrangement, but an institution. It outlived Hattusili. It outlived Matharnefer. It even outlived the city of Kadesh itself, which never again regained its pre-war prominence. Ramesses passed the torch to his successors with a border still intact and with Syria at least partially compliant with Egyptian interests. That, in the political terms of empire, was an astonishing success. The final irony of Kadesh was this: the battle that failed to deliver victory for either side delivered a peace that defined a generation. The blood spilled on its dry plains had not bought conquest, but it had bought time. Time for trade, time for cities to grow, time for kings to age in peace rather than in armor. In the ruins of ancient capitals, thousands of years later, when the treaty was rediscovered, first in Hattusa, then recognized by Egyptologists comparing hieroglyphs, historians realized what the ancients had created. It was not myth. It was not propaganda. It was a contract signed in clay and stone by men who understood that the greatest legacy they could leave was not the ashes of war, but the ink of agreement. And so, long after the chariot wheels stopped rolling, long after the names of minor kings were forgotten, the Battle of Kadesh became more than a military event. It became a pivot in history, where war met its limit, and diplomacy began to define what it meant to rule. As the memory of Kadesh transformed from battlefield chaos into diplomatic legend, its significance spread far beyond the dusty roads of Syria or the inner courts of Egypt and Hittite. It permeated the consciousness of an entire region, from Cyprus to Babylon, from Mycenae to the mountain cities of Anatolia. 4 generations of rulers, the events surrounding Kadesh became a lesson, not in conquest, but in coexistence. The concept of great kings, rulers who respected each other's sovereignty while acknowledging rivalry, became an essential framework for Bronze Age international relations. In the aftermath of the treaty, both empires began investing in long-term projects that were only possible under conditions of stability. Ramesses II, unburdened by open war with Hittite, expanded his building campaigns on a scale never before attempted in Egypt. Entire cities were reconstructed. The city of Ramesses in the eastern delta was developed into a grand capital, complete with temples, colossal statues, wide avenues, and military facilities. Its proximity to the northeastern frontier made it a strategic and symbolic choice, both a warning and a welcome to any approaching diplomat or caravan. This newfound stability allowed Ramesses to commission the famous temples of Abu Simbel Deep in Nubia. Though far from Hittite territory, these monuments were intended to project power southward and cement Egyptian control over the Nile corridor. The larger of the 2 temples featured 4 massive seated statues of the pharaoh himself, carved directly into the cliffside, a literal embodiment of eternal kingship. The inscriptions and reliefs within still glorified Kadesh, depicting the pharaoh as a warrior king, frozen in the moment of divine triumph. Yet by this time, the real victory was not in the sword but in the pen. In Hittite, Hattusili III used the stability to consolidate control over Anatolia. He reorganized administrative regions, reinforced vassal loyalty, and invested in large-scale religious ceremonies honoring the storm gods of his people. His wife, Queen Pujahipa, played a central role in this era, not merely as consort, but as co-ruler and high priestess. She corresponded with foreign courts, issued royal decrees, and directly participated in legal and diplomatic matters. Her presence added legitimacy to the Hittite regime and offered a unique continuity as the reign of Hattusili gave way to his successors. The institutional memory of the Kadesh Treaty shaped how both empires interacted with their neighbors. When Babylon sent envoys to Egypt, they used the title "your brother," drawing directly from the diplomatic language solidified by Ramesses and Hattusili. The format of peace, a treaty sealed by oaths to shared deities, backed by royal marriage and mutual recognition, became a model that outlasted the very empires that created it. It was diplomacy codified, precedent established. Even the rising Assyrians would, in time, adapt these methods as they expanded their dominion. Perhaps most profoundly, Kadesh influenced the cultural imagination of what kingship could be. The divine warrior ideal remained central, but it was now complemented by the role of the wise statesman. Kings were not just men who commanded armies. They were expected to negotiate, to correspond with rivals as equals, to consider alliances as seriously as campaigns. The notion that a king could be remembered not only for the cities he burned, but for the peace he forged, was a legacy born from the aftermath of that battle. This shift echoed in art and literature. In Egypt, scribes began composing elaborate accounts of the pharaoh's correspondence, stylized as epic narratives. The poem of Pentor and the bulletin inscribed on temple walls immortalized Ramesses' role in the battle, yet simultaneously offered insight into the intellectual framing of the event, not just as conflict, but as a performance of divine kingship tested in human crisis. These texts were copied and studied, not only for their content, but for their form. They became teaching tools in scribal schools. Boys learning to write in the shadow of Karnak practiced with excerpts from Kadesh texts, ensuring that the story would be etched not only into stone, but into the minds of future elites. In the Hittite world, the Kadesh Treaty was remembered differently, not as singular heroism, but as evidence of royal authority and international legitimacy. The copies found in Hattusha's archives were stored with other royal decrees, grouped with legal codes and treaties with other states. They were not mythologized in the same way, but they were studied, cited, and referenced when new agreements were made. Later kings of Hutti used it as precedent in negotiations, invoking the name of Hattusili to reinforce their own stature. Even as Hutti faced new threats from Western seafarers, internal revolts, and growing Assyrian power, the Kadesh Treaty remained a symbol of what the empire could achieve at its height. But history is not static. The Bronze Age, with all its splendor and diplomacy, was approaching its twilight. By the mid-12th century BCE, a century after Kadesh, waves of destruction swept across the eastern Mediterranean. Known today as the Bronze Age collapse, this period saw the sudden fall of great cities, the breakdown of trade networks, and the disappearance of writing systems in many regions. Mycenaean palaces burned. Ugarit, once a flourishing hub of Egyptian Hittite trade, was destroyed. Hattusa itself was abandoned, and the Hittite Empire fragmented into small Neo-Hittite kingdoms. Yet even as physical cities crumbled, the memory of Kadesh endured. It had been chiseled into stone in Egypt, baked into clay in Hutti, and embedded into the legal and diplomatic DNA of the ancient world. Its lessons, that pride can be tempered by necessity, that enemies can become correspondents, that peace can be a deliberate creation rather than a default, survived the collapse of the very world that had birthed them. In the modern era, thousands of years later, fragments of the treaty were unearthed by archaeologists in Hattusa, and the Egyptian copies were reinterpreted with a growing understanding of hieroglyphs. Scholars from across nations studied the treaty, realizing its global significance. In the 20th century, a replica of the Kadesh Treaty was mounted on a wall at the United Nations headquarters in New York, not as a symbol of ancient empires, but as a reminder that even in an age of chariots and superstition, humanity had discovered the value of mutual agreement. What began as a battle, brutal, confused, inconclusive, ended as a legacy. The city of Kadesh may be lost to time, buried beneath layers of history and silence, but its name survives as the birthplace of diplomacy. The warriors are gone, the kings long dead, but their decision to negotiate, to wed rivals, to ink a promise of peace, echoes still. Not in blood, but in words. Not in ruin, but in memory. By the time the flames of the Bronze Age collapse swept across the eastern Mediterranean, the world shaped by the Battle of Kadesh had already begun to fracture. Yet, even amid that turmoil, the influence of the treaty and the norms it established radiated outward, quietly guiding how later civilizations would conceptualize diplomacy, conflict resolution, and royal legitimacy. After Ramesses II's death, possibly in his 90s, after a reign of 66 years, his successors inherited an Egypt that had avoided collapse, largely due to the stability his treaties had secured. The Egyptian-Hittite Accord had granted Egypt critical breathing room. Though later pharaohs would struggle with internal challenges, economic pressure, and external shifts in regional power, they did so from a position of relative calm. The eastern frontier, once the flashpoint of generations of warfare, remained quiet for decades. This was no accident. The Kadesh legacy had, quite literally, bought Egypt time. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire faced a different fate. After Hattusili III's death, the throne passed to Tudhaliya IV, who tried to maintain his father's diplomatic achievements. The treaty with Egypt held firm, even as Hutti's periphery began to unravel. Assyrian aggression intensified in the east and the western seaboard of Anatolia. Once a patchwork of Hittite-controlled vassals, became increasingly unstable. Sea peoples, raiders from the Aegean and beyond, began harassing the coasts, disrupting trade routes that had been stabilized by the treaty. Still, the idea of international order, created in part by the Kadesh Agreement, persisted. Even as cities burned and kingdoms fell, the structure of international diplomacy that had emerged from that treaty lived on, if only in fragments. The expectation that states could formalize peace, that rulers could recognize mutual sovereignty, that treaties could involve divine witnesses and last across reigns. These ideas were revolutionary in their day, and they would echo through future ages. The smaller kingdoms that survived the collapse, such as the Neo-Hittite states in northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia, remembered the greatness of Hutti and retained many of its diplomatic habits. They continued to write in Luwian hieroglyphs and maintained clay archives. Egyptian influence lingered as well. Religious iconography in places like Carchemish and Aleppo shows hybrid forms of worship, with Egyptian motifs present alongside Hittite and local gods. These were not cultural impositions. They were residue from decades of interaction during and after the Kadesh peace. The long shadow of Kadesh was not confined to its immediate aftermath. When the Neo-Assyrian Empire rose to dominance centuries later, its scribes and diplomats adopted many of the mechanisms formalized by the Hittites and Egyptians. Assyrian treaties, often backed by terrible oaths and divine curses, bore structural resemblance to the Kadesh Agreement. While Assyria was more brutal in its enforcement of loyalty, its administrative class understood the concept of formal, reciprocal agreements between sovereign powers. It was not coincidence. The Assyrians had studied the tablets from previous empires. They were inheritors of a world order that Kadesh had helped shape. Even further west, echoes of Kadesh can be detected. When Phoenician and later Greek city-states began establishing colonies and formal pacts in the Iron Age, they too developed systems of treaties, oaths, and alliances. While these were adapted to local political conditions, the foundation, that complex societies could resolve rivalry through agreement rather than annihilation, remained. In the Aegean, oral traditions preserve stories of heroic age battles and fragile truces, and while these legends, like those found in Homeric epics, were mythologized, they paralleled what Kadesh had demonstrated. That battle could forge respect, and respect could build order. But perhaps the most telling legacy came not through bloodlines or archives, but through memory. Kadesh was remembered. It was carved into the walls of Karnak and Luxor. In the 7th century BCE, Assyrian kings, such as Ashurbanipal, sent agents to collect copies of ancient treaties, including those from Egypt and Hutti. Babylonian scribes translated them. Hittite-style diplomacy, once thought lost, resurfaced in the chancelleries of the Neo-Babylonian and Persian empires. Cyrus the Great, when constructing his model of imperial governance in the 6th century BCE, used diplomatic norms strikingly similar to those formalized centuries earlier between Ramesses and Hattusili. That was the enduring genius of the Kadesh Treaty. It had transformed ephemeral politics into durable precedent. It didn't matter that the clay tablets cracked or that the palaces of Hattusa turned to rubble. The concept of formal peace agreements, complete with divine guarantees and mutual benefits, had been unleashed into human civilization. Future empires, Rome, Byzantium, even medieval Islamic and Christian courts, would craft treaties with ceremonial oaths, witness gods or saints, shared terminology, and diplomatic rituals that had their roots in Bronze Age models. In the modern world, when the United Nations was created after the Second World War, the symbolic power of Kadesh returned. A replica of the treaty was placed on a wall at UN headquarters, not as decoration, but as a reminder. The plaque does not depict battle scenes or triumphs of one king over another. It shows the text of an agreement: dry, technical, deliberate. It is a symbol that law can outlast war, that even in an age of kings and chariots, people could choose peace. And thus, the true legacy of Kadesh is not found in the exact location of the battlefield, which remains debated by archaeologists. It is not found in the number of chariots or casualties. It lies instead in the decision made by two rulers, not to annihilate one another, but to negotiate. Ramesses II and Hattusili III could have let pride or fear drag them into another generation of war. Instead, they carve an agreement into the memory of civilization. More than 3,000 years later, we remember that moment not for its destruction, but for its restraint. For the realization, hard-won and carved in stone, that enduring power lies not in how many enemies one can slay, but in how many one can understand. The most remarkable element of the Kadesh legacy is that it transcended the very context in which it was born. It was not merely a treaty to end one war. It was a conceptual shift, a moment in which humanity, in its ancient infancy, chose a framework of parity over annihilation. From that point forward, even as empires fell and languages vanished, the intellectual DNA of Kadesh lingered in how future societies structured relationships between powers. One must understand how rare this was in the context of the time. The late Bronze Age was not gentle. It was a world built on oaths backed by spears, diplomacy enforced by tribute, and treaties often observed only as long as one side held military superiority. The idea that two superpowers, the Egyptian and Hittite empires, would formalize an agreement on equal terms, codify it in a common international language, Akkadian, and publicize it for generations, was without precedent. Even the wording of the treaty itself was revolutionary. It stated that neither king would attack the other's land, that fugitives would be extradited without harm, and that they would come to each other's aid if third parties threatened peace. In effect, it was a proto-alliance, an early model of mutual defense and non-aggression. Most treaties before it, if they existed at all, were declarations by victors over the vanquished. Kadesh was different. It did not declare submission, it declared equality. Hittite and Egypt were rivals, but they would act as peers, not predators. And behind that formal language was a much deeper recognition that stability was more valuable than territory. That lesson, hard-learned through the bloodshed on the Orontes, shaped how both empires pursued foreign policy in the decades to come. Egypt, for example, shifted its focus inward. The massive building programs of Ramesses II, including his mortuary temple, the Ramesseum, and the expansion of Karnak, were only possible because Egypt no longer had to divert vast resources to military campaigns in the north. These architectural achievements were not idle vanity. They served multiple roles, consolidating power at home, employing thousands of workers and artisans, reinforcing Egypt's divine ideology, and projecting stability to neighbors and rivals alike. Had Egypt continued a war footing against Hittite, much of this cultural and infrastructural investment would have been impossible. The peace, in short, allowed Egypt to thrive culturally, even as the world beyond its borders grew more volatile. In Hittite, the peace had a similarly profound effect. Freed from defending its southern frontier, the Hittite court could focus on internal reforms and religious consolidation. Hattusili III and Queen Pujahipa restructured administrative networks and issued legal proclamations that strengthened the central authority. Pujahipa, especially, became an emblem of this post-Kadesh diplomacy. She corresponded with Ramesses herself, referred to him as brother, and wielded influence equal to that of male envoys. Her voice, preserved in letters found at Hattusa, provides a rare female perspective in an otherwise male-dominated international sphere. She did not act merely as consort, but as an autonomous agent of policy. Her letters combined personal appeals, spiritual invocations, and diplomatic subtlety. She even offered commentary on the marriage of her daughter to Ramesses, noting that it was not just a union of bloodlines, but of destinies. This, again, underscores the sophistication of Hittite diplomacy and its commitment to turning Kadesh into not just an end to war, but the beginning of an era. The impact of this treaty reached unexpected places. In the coastal cities of the Levant, merchants and scribes adapted to the new climate. With the road between Memphis and Hattusa no longer lined with armies, trade flourished. We have letters from Ugarit mentioning peaceful exchanges of goods once difficult to transport during wartime. Glass, ivory, wine, cedar wood, papyrus, and tin. The port of Byblos, long contested, became a conduit of peacetime commerce. This economic surge allowed urban centers to rebuild and expand, contributing to a cultural boom that would make the Levant a prize for later empires. Beyond material benefits, the concept of formalized diplomacy found its way into how societies recorded and remembered their own histories. In Egypt, papyri from the reigns of Ramesses' successors cite the treaty as a legal precedent. Hittite legal texts, meanwhile, incorporated the terminology of the Kadesh Accord into subsequent treaties with other states. The structure of mutual assistance clauses, the obligation to protect refugees, and shared oaths to divine powers would echo in later Near Eastern diplomacy, particularly in Babylonian and Assyrian legal traditions. Perhaps even more intriguing is how the memory of Kadesh fed into myth. Over generations, the specifics of the battle were absorbed into Egypt's broader cultural narrative. In art and literature, Ramesses was no longer merely the king who signed a treaty. He became the archetypal pharaoh, the man who fought alone, who stood when others fled, who brought order out of chaos. Whether or not the hyperbolic accounts of his solo combat were ever true, they became emotionally true for the Egyptian people. The line between historical event and national mythology blurred. Kadesh had been a draw, militarily, but in memory, it was transformed into triumph, not just of arms but of wisdom. This blending of fact and myth would repeat throughout history. The Romans would do it at Cannae and Actium. The Byzantines would do it at Nineveh and Manzikert. Every great civilization has moments of ambiguous outcome that they enshrine as clarity. Kadesh was Egypt's prototype, and in a way, it was also the world's first example of spinning narrative into nationhood. Even as Egypt declined in the centuries that followed, falling to Libyan and then Nubian dynasties, the idea of formal diplomacy endured. The Assyrians, who would dominate the Near East in the 9th to 7th centuries BCE, built upon the Kadesh framework, issuing treaties that included loyalty oaths, witness gods, and international boundaries. Their methods were harsher, but the structure was unmistakably derived. In the modern era, with the decipherment of hieroglyphs and cuneiform in the 19th century, scholars began to unearth the depth of this ancient accord. The full Hittite version was discovered at Hattusa in the early 20th century, written in Akkadian on clay tablets. Meanwhile, Egyptian copies inscribed on the walls of temples like Karnak provided the other half. Together, they told a full story, not just a battle but of dialogue. When that treaty was mounted in the United Nations, the world paused, not to celebrate ancient glory, but to acknowledge something older than flags or borders: the human capacity to stop killing and start writing. Thus, in the grand arc of history, the Battle of Kadesh holds a place far greater than its immediate outcome. It began as a clash of empires over a dusty fortress. It ended as the first recorded moment in human history where two great powers chose coexistence over conquest, and in doing so, changed what civilization could mean.